Hello, folks. So Brittany gave a bit of an introduction there. I won't need to do much more, less than saying hello and thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I was in Massachusetts a couple months ago at I think it was University of Boston. I was in Boston doing a conference there. I'm in the middle of farming season, so that's why I'm wearing a tank top. I was out planting microgreens in the heat before I came in, so this is kind of fun to do this in the middle of season. So I won't give much, I'm not going to give any introduction to my work and what I do. I'm assuming that most of you know. There was some links that I sent Brittany to share with you, so perhaps some of you have seen my YouTube videos, or you've read my book, or you've seen some of the other work that I do. This little presentation is going to be strictly content-based. There's no real fluff here. Just trying to give you guys some value on some techniques you can use on your farm or your urban farm. None of this is exclusive to urban farming whatsoever. It's more based around market gardening, but even people who run businesses will get some value out of this no matter what you do. So this is a series of systems that I use, production systems I use on my farm to leverage our labor and do more with less. So we've been able to grow our profitability of our farm for a number of years now without taking on any more land at all. It's been a system of refinement, and a lot of the specific techniques and production systems I'm going to show you tonight are a part of how we've grown. So right now we're farming on a little less than a half an acre, and we're going to do about $120,000 in sales this year. Last year we did $100,000. Before that we did $85,000. So we've grown over the last 3 years without taking on any more land, and a lot of it has to do with these specific techniques that we're going to look at. So before we get into the actual specific techniques on the ground, I want to talk about some core principles that are very important for how we manage our time and our efforts on the farm. And the first one is the Pareto principle, the rule of 80-20. This is a very classic principle that people in business use. It's nothing new at all, but I often find that people don't really think about where their Pareto principle is no matter what they're doing. And so the basic idea is that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. So there's an old saying in business that 20% of your customers will bring 80% of your business. 20% of your products will be 80% of your revenue. 20% of your services will be 80% of your business. So it's something that exists everywhere. And the more I've studied the Pareto principle, the more I've seen it in everything. And it's really all about focusing on that 20%. So identifying what is that 20% for all these different things. So what is the 20% of the products that you produce that bring you 80% of your revenues? Who are the 20% of the customers that bring you 80% of the revenues? It's all about understanding this principle so that you can identify what that is for you, and then you can use this to further decide where you want to concentrate your efforts. Because by concentrating on the things that have the greater leverage is a way that you can essentially work less and make more. And we all want to do that, right? We don't want to be burnt out farmers who are bitter about never having time to spend with your kids, or having a social life, or getting to do any of the lovely things that some people who just work 9-to-5 jobs get to do. So we all want to do those things, and that's what this stuff is all about. So it's all about the higher yield for the least amount of input. And so if we're talking about, let's say we're talking about products. Well, let's identify what those products are. So for myself, I've grown about 80 different types of vegetables on my farm over the last 7 years. And each year I refine more and more down to what are the crops and products that make us the most amount of money. And what I'm going to do with those things is I'm going to concentrate my efforts on those. I'm going to double down, meaning that I'm going to do more of them. I'm going to find ways that I can add value to those things. And I also use those as research and development. So the research and development side of it more stands out for your customers. So for example, 20% of people who shop from you at the farmer's market spend 80% or give you 80% of the money you make at that farmer's market. So you want to apply these 4 principles here. Concentrate your efforts on that 20%, double down on them, put more effort into them, offer them more things, adding value to them, and then essentially using them as a research and development team. This is one of the greatest things about selling at farmers markets. It's why I always encourage farmers to start at farmers markets, because even if you don't want to be at a market and don't foresee selling there for the foreseeable future, then what you can learn there, though, is incredible, because it is literally an ecosystem of minds. The marketplace, farmers market, is what I like to call is the real traditional capitalism, the real just people showing up with stuff and selling it. And the great thing about that is you've got all these people coming and going, and there's so much you can learn and harvest, the information you can harvest from that space, that if you concentrate your efforts on this 20% of the customers that come into your market, they will be a little bit more dedicated to what you're doing, because they have a vested interest in you. They like your product. They might like you as a person. They like your brand. And, you know, one thing I'm always doing at the market is when I want to try a new product, I'll bring, say, 10 or 20 units of it to the market, and I'll give some of it to each of those customers that I identify. I know them by name. They're the people that are always coming and going. I will give them product and say, hey, try this week and let me know what you think. And so this is where their research and development thing comes in, is the people that spend the most amount of money and time with you, those are the people you want to learn more about what they like, so that you can add value. You can double down on the products that they like and concentrate your efforts on them. So that's really what this is all about from a customer standpoint. From a product standpoint, it's a similar thing, maybe minus the research and development, but it's continuously finding more ways to do more of what people want. That's really what it's about. And the same applies to services. The same even applies to systems you use on your farm. What are the things you do the most on your farm, or not necessarily the most, but what are the things that you do that are the most effective use of your time? So let's say, for example, one extreme example for me is managing my compost piles is not an effective use of my time. A more effective use of my time is going out and planting crops or harvesting crops. So there's things that I basically categorize in order of this importance. What are the things that deliver value to our farm and my life, and what are the things that don't in the immediate do that? And so we're looking at that on the flip side as well. What are the things that, what's that 80% of things that don't bring a ton of value? Some of them need to happen, and some of the, as far as the customer side, you still need to sell to those customers. But we want to basically find ways of streamlining, hastening, or mitigating and eliminating the task customers and things that aren't really that valuable. And so the compost example is one for us. I do make my own compost, but I don't spend a ton of time doing it, and it's not a priority for me. My time can be better spent buying compost from a guy I know in town who makes it and does a really good job. I get better value from buying it at $60 a yard than I do making it myself, because my labor is not worth that task. Having said that, you know, different types of tasks on the farm, some things still need to be done, but what can you do to make those things faster? What can you do to hasten those things? And what can you do to eliminate them altogether? So on a product standpoint, some of the things, some crops we've eliminated altogether because they're just not worth growing for us. Like I eliminated growing pak choy and bok choy just this year from last year. Wasn't worth my time, wasn't really worth the yield and the effort that I put into it. And instead of having beds dedicated to that, I dedicated more beds on my farm to salad mix and the crops that I know I can sell and the crops that are always in demand. And having said that, there's some things that I like to grow just so I can have a variety. And so those are the things that might go under the category there to mitigate. I might mitigate them, but just have enough so that I can keep enough of that product to have a foot in the marketplace and not necessarily lose market share, but have it as an attractor to when people come to the market stand. So that something like that might be spring onions. You know, I only grow a 6-foot bed of spring onions a few times a season, just so I can bring 10 bunches to the market so they're there. It's not a crop that I move a lot of volume of, and it's not a crop that I want to do a lot of because it's tedious, it's fairly low value, but people like it. And I can grow it in a small space, so I can justify growing it, but I'm going to just do a little bit of it to get market share. So that's the basic idea with 80-20 and how we concentrate efforts on the 20% of things that yield 80% and reduce our efforts to the 80% that only yield the 20%. So the other way of thinking about this is how you optimize your effectiveness. And I use this chart to show how effective a person can be in a period of time. So on the bottom line here, we've got 0 to 100% of the time. That is to complete a particular task. And then on the top graph, we've got 0% to 100% quality. Where is the sweet spot where the quality is good enough and it meets the time requirement to get that task done quickly? So one example is I've got a nice glass of iced tea here made by my girlfriend, but if you take a glass of water and you put it under the tap and you flip the tap on, it fills up really quickly, but then that top bit of it, maybe the top 20% of it is just bubbles. So in order to get this glass filled right to the top, you need to slow the tap down. But you'll notice that you filled up 80% of that glass in about 50% of the time. The last 50% of time was taken just to fill up the last 20%. And so this same idea can be used for almost any task you do on your farm, almost anything you do in your life. So the rule isn't necessarily do 80% across the board for everything. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that there's a sweet spot, and I find it's often 80%. Like, you know, if you're washing carrots and you miss the odd little carrot here and there, how much time does it take you to methodically make sure every single carrot is perfect when the average customer is barely going to notice and it's not really a big deal? So it's about finding where is that sweet spot. Where is the part that's good enough? So say I'm bagging 4-ounce bags of salad mix for the farmer's market. If I have 4.3 ounces, good enough. If I have 4.5 ounces, good enough. If I have 5 ounces, good enough. To sit there and pick out little leaves to make sure you have the perfect 4-ounce bag isn't worth the time. And it's not even really worth the cost of the extra greens you might throw in that bag. It's very marginal and hard to measure. You know, if you're doing something on the scale of millions of units, then that's something altogether, and then you probably have machines that do it for you anyways. But the idea is that where does your time and quality meet that sweet spot to say that it's good enough? And so this idea, paired with the Pareto principle, is essentially what we apply to every single thing we do on the farm, all of our customers, all the products that we produce, everything goes through this filter. So this is the main reason why we are effective on our farm, and we can run our farm with 2 people with a total of 60 hours a week to do everything that we do $120,000 in sales on a less than a half-acre farm. That's the basic framework that we're following, and from here we're going to look at some specific systems. And again, we'll take questions at the end. So one thing that's important to point out on our farm is everything is a 30-inch bed. All of our production is standardized to a 30-inch bed. This has become a very uniform production system for most market gardeners today. Anybody that's using hand tools or small-scale machinery like walk-behind tractors is more or less doing a 30-inch bed. And the 30-inch bed is great because it allows you to have some flexibility on the bed like you see here, whereas I can straddle the bed in different ways. So there's some ergonomics built into this because we're talking about farms where they're owner-operators, where the people that own the farm are the ones working on it. We're not talking about large-scale farms where you've got hundreds of workers out in the field. We're talking about people that are in their operation and they're doing many things. So the bed system is ergonomic for the body so that you aren't in the same position day in and day out grinding it out. But there's also the production about it is great in the sense that we've got a bed that at 50 to 75% of whatever crop we're growing in our beds, when they're 50% to 75% mature, they essentially shade out what's in the bed. So there's weed protection built into that system. There's also less evaporation, better water management built into that system, and also just practicality in that I can walk across a 30-inch bed. So on our little farm plots, we have 2,000 and 5,000 square foot plots in the downtown core of our city. I can walk in and out. So accessibility is something that's important to this. A lot of people like to go 4-foot wide beds, and it makes sense if you're doing everything with a tractor. But if you're not using a tractor and you're using small pieces of land, accessibility is something that's really important. Because if you think about having a 2,000 or 5,000 square foot block, and you're coming in and out of that block to plant, harvest, and manage on a daily basis, and every time you want to get to a certain bed, you've got to go around, all the way around to get to a particular area. When you've got a 30-inch bed and you can just diagonal across, this is a time management thing. And when you stack that over many months of the year, this is going to save you hours at the end of the season. So there's many things. There's a lot of other things in a 30-inch bed. I won't get into it too much, but you'll kind of see as we go through some of these slides the reason behind the 30-inch bed. Perhaps the most important aspect of a 30-inch bed for us on our farm is we categorize our types of land into what I call a land hierarchy. And there's two types of land that we farm on our farm, and that's specifically because we're urban. So there's a lot of crops I don't grow on my farm, and we'll talk about crops in a couple minutes, but we don't grow anything that's low value, that has a long date to maturity, and then requires a lot of space. Everything we do is on the flip side. Fast days to maturity, high density, high price per pound, short days that grows fast, and there's some other categories I'll talk about coming up. But the basic idea here is that every single bed on our farm has at least 2 crops in it throughout the season. There are no beds anywhere on my farm that have just 1 crop. Everything is producing at least 2 crops. So that eliminates a lot of stuff. That eliminates long season potatoes, winter squash, melons. That takes a lot of crops out of the picture. And so it means that we're looking to get a higher dollar value per square foot on our beds. So our beds on average are 25 feet. A lot of them have become 50 feet, but these numbers that I'm going to show you here are outlining what we would produce on a 25-foot bed. So our high rotation areas, and I'll skip to this for a second here, is all the plots that are in this inner zone. So this is a map of my city. Where I'm sitting talking to you today is on this orange dot. This is my home base, which is a farm, and it's where is our main base of operations. We wash our vegetables here. We do most of our work here. And the inner zone here, these 2 other plots, there's actually 3 other plots in here now. That is our high rotation area. So that means that all the plots in that area, we're growing crops that are fast turnover and have a pretty high yield. So we're talking about quick growing stuff like radishes, salad turnips, all kinds of different cut and come again salad greens. These are crops that have a fast date to maturity. Like in the summer right now, I plant arugula in the ground. It's ready in 21 days. I get 1 cut and then I turn it over. So that's 1 crop in 21 days. Same for radishes, not so different for salad turnips, and the same for most of our other salad mixes. So these beds are literally high rotation. They're turned over, the soil is amended, they're planted to something else. So each of these 25-foot beds will have a minimum or an average of 4 crops per season. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's as much as 6. But on average, each of these beds can generate $800 per 25-foot bed by 30-inch bed per season. So it's an average of 4 crops. The birotation plots are beds or plots that are a little bit further in the network. So they're outside of this second ring here. These are plots that we don't want to go to as often. They're plots that we might only go there once a week, and they'll have 2 successions of a crop. So that could be something like this image you see here. This is patty pan squash. I usually don't plant my patty pan squash or summer squash until about mid-May. That means before that time, there's a window where I can get a short season, quick growing crop in there. So often it's something like that does well in the cold in the spring. So it could be a radish crop, a spinach crop, arugula. It could even be turnips. Something that I can grow in about 45 days or less. I can plant as early as March, put a low tunnel on it, and have that crop harvested and out of the ground before the patty pan squash goes in. So that's how I get my 2 crops. On the flip side of that, you can do something like kale. Kale is a crop we'll look at in a second that I refer to as a steady crop. It goes in the ground early spring, and I'll steadily harvest it for a period of time, but I usually pull it out of the ground by August when the aphid pressure gets too hot, and then I can have another crop going into the fall. Sometimes I can even get 2 more successions of quick growing crops after that crop. But on average, those beds will make $400 per season. So the whole point of this is it really makes it easy to understand economically what my farm can produce. It's simply a matter of calculating how many beds do I have on my farm total that are dedicated to high rotation. So it's that number of beds times 800. So let's say I had 100 beds in high rotation dedicated to that, times that by 800. That means I could make $80,000 of revenue off those 100 beds. And then if I had another 100 beds, just as an arbitrary number, in by rotation, it would be half of that. Keep in mind that those beds are half the work and sometimes even less, because a crop like patty pan squash goes in the ground. I put landscape fabric on it. It's got drip irrigation underneath it. All I have to do is plant it and harvest it. There's no other management that has to happen. I don't have to go and weed it or anything like that. These crops just produce. It's the same with our kale crops. It's all on landscape fabric. We just harvest them. That's the only work that has to happen. So to put this in perspective a little bit, here's an example of an old plot that I had. This is one of the first farm plots that I started with. This is a front yard in high rotation. So each of these beds would be producing 4 different crops per season. And please keep in mind that these numbers are actually very conservative. And I've arrived at these numbers by basically taking the averages over the last 6 years of all my farm and taking into account pest problems, irrigation failures, germination problems with the seed, you name it. Taking in all the failures into account, on average, we can do $800 per bed in high rotation. So sometimes our beds, a 25-foot bed is making up to $2,000 or more on our farm. And that's sort of a best case scenario. But we don't want to go on best case scenarios, right? We want to go on what's the average and what can we use to predict with. So this is the average size of a yard in North America. So with all suburbia, so I'm not talking about downtown Boston, I'm not talking about Manhattan, I'm talking about looking at all the suburban homes and urban homes in the United States. The average lot size is 2,000 of a front yard. So this means that if you just to put this in perspective for you guys, if a person had their front yard in high rotation crops and you had 24 beds in that high rotation, that means you could have $19,000 of revenue from a front yard in a suburban area. And most homes have 2 yards. They have a front and backyard. So do the math there. That means that a suburban home could be growing around $40,000 of product in a 7 to 8 month growing season. So the numbers are pretty staggering and incredible, and the potential to revolutionize how people think about agriculture, but also get a ton of new people to work and doing something with purpose is absolutely immense. So here is the zoning of our city, and this is a very old idea. This idea of zones, those of you who are familiar with permaculture know that there are the zones of intensities, if you will. They have your zone 1, which is your home base. You got your herb garden there, you got your kitchen garden, and then you get to your outer zones, and the things that require less continual work are on the outskirts. Like on a homestead, you might have your cattle and your fruit trees on the outside of that. But in the sense of a city, the way I think about zoning my farm is very similar to this idea. And so this guy, Johann Heinrich von Thunen, came up with this idea in the 1800s. He wrote a book called The Isolated State, which was talking about how we would design cities based on scarce resources and considering what the products that are being produced, do they suffer in spoilage when they're in transit? How much land do they require to grow? It's some of these basic ideas. It's like saying, how logical is it to grow salad greens in California and then ship them to Boston when the shelf life of the salad mix is relatively short, it loses its nutritional value. And these aren't all things that I'm going to show you with how I design my farm, but they're things to take into consideration. Is that if you look at all the crops that we grow that humans need on a daily basis, it makes the most sense to have the market gardens closest to where people are, and that is the specific types of crops. So it doesn't make sense for an urban farmer to grow grains, corn, potatoes, winter squash, and melons in a city, because a lot of those crops have a long shelf life. They can be transported, but they also require a lot of space. So in a city, real estate is at a premium. So if you're going to grow agricultural crops on city land, you want to have the maximum amount of production and value that you can get out of that land. It's just simply economics. So on the crop side, I divide all of my crops into 2 categories, And that's because I grow a select group of crops, and this is what I encourage all urban farmers to do, and not even just urban farmers, but any market gardeners who are on a limited land base. I encourage people to go through this process. We're going to look at 5 categories after this slide of how you would grade the crops you grow to decide what makes sense to grow on your land base. But I divide all of my crops into 2 categories. We have quick crops and we have steady crops. Quick crops are anything that grows within 60 days or less. So cut salad greens, radishes, turnips, some herbs like cilantro and parsley into the summer. Even some kind of, sometimes carrots and beets grown in the summer can be considered a quick crop because you can grow a baby carrot and have it in and out of the ground in 60 days. Same with beets. So those crops are often, they're not always one-off. They're, some of these greens are cut and come again, so we'll get a few different harvests from each one, and then we'll turn it over, amend the soil with some kind of compost or manure or organic fertilizer, whatever you're using, and then plant the crop again. The thing that's important to recognize about quick crops as well is that, by and large, they are mostly low feeders. So all these types of greens, radishes, salad turnips, they don't draw a lot from the soil. Whereas the really long season crops, like on the flip side, where you've got melons and winter squash and corn, these crops are heavy feeders. They need a lot from the soil, whereas crops like this don't. And so that also lends itself well to an urban environment where you're often dealing with marginal soils, where you have to come in and build up the soil. Contamination is a whole other issue. We can talk about that during questions, but if you don't have contaminated soil, you're often just dealing with kind of rubble soil. Like there's not a lot of nutrients in it, but you can come in with a little bit of compost and a little bit of love on your soil, and you can generate a product and a good yield really easily because these crops don't need a lot. Whereas if you were to go into an urban lot and you wanted to plant corn, well, it's probably not going to yield that much because the soil isn't capable of doing it. So the steady crops are crops that are grown on a continual basis, that we continually harvest from them. So things like tomatoes, kale, summer squash like patty pans, or some kinds of peppers. We can set these crops in the ground and we can just pick them consistently for the better part of the season. So those are the 2 types of crop categories that I grow in, and those are basically, they fit within the high rotation and bi-rotation system. So high rotation plots are pretty much growing exclusively quick growing crops, and bi-rotation crops are going to have one succession of a steady crop and then another succession of a quick crop. So again, you'll nowhere on my farm will you see us growing any low value crops like potatoes and melons and winter squash and corn. We're pretty much exclusively growing crops that are quick growing, out of the ground quick, have a high density per square foot. And these are the categories that I use to basically determine what are the things that I want to focus on. This is kind of coming back to the 80-20 rule. Like, where's that 20% that gives us the 80% of our return? And these are 5 categories that I find if you look at any product or crop you want to grow or produce, and you put them through this grading system, it will tell you a lot about what makes the most sense to grow on a small land base. So that's what this is mainly about. If we're talking about organic farming on 5 to 10 acres, this isn't as important as it is if you want to have an acre or less market garden that is super profitable. So if you want to make $100,000 or more on a half an acre, you really got to look at these categories. So these aren't really in order of importance except the first one. So essentially what is happening with this grading system is we're getting a yes or a no. Does that crop have this characteristic? If it does, it gets a yes. If it doesn't, it gets a no. It doesn't necessarily mean that we won't grow that crop. It just means that we'll grade it and we'll look at it. So I'll go through this process and I'll use one example. And you can write these down and take a list of all the crops that you want to grow and grade them by this. And some will be 3 out of 5, some will be 4 out of 5, some will be 5 out of 5. And it'll tell you where you might want to concentrate your efforts. So the first one, which is absolutely the most important, is popularity. If the crop you want to grow or the product you want to produce isn't popular and in demand, well, then the rest of these don't really matter, because that is the number one thing. I've consulted for farmers all over the United States and even a greater part of the world, and a lot of them come into it saying, I want to grow this and this and this because of whatever reasons. Problem is when you get it out to the marketplace, people don't buy it, and that's the hard truth of the marketplace is you might have an idea of how the world ought to be and what people ought to eat, and consume. But what they want and what they spend their money on is an entirely different thing. So this is where we need to often check our ideology and make sure that we are producing things that people want. So that's the number one. Is it popular? Yes. If it is, it gets a check. If it isn't, scratch it off the list, and I would probably just not even grow it and even go through the rest of this process. The second one is days to maturity, DTM. So when you open up your seed catalog for Johnny Seeds and you see radishes 28 DTM, that means that's 28 days to maturity. That is the average days to maturity of that crop. That's not the days to maturity of it in the spring, fall, or winter. It's the average days to maturity in the summer and more or less the better part of the season. So it's the average. So my rule of thumb is if it can be grown in 60 days or less, it'll meet that quick crop category. Then it would score here. If it doesn't grow within 60 days or less, that doesn't mean I won't grow it. It just means it doesn't score here, and I'm going to look at it slightly different when I'm planning my farm. So the third one is yield. We're looking for a high yield per linear foot. So I'm in a 30-inch bed. I want to get, what do we want? A half a pound per linear foot in bed. So that means on a 20-foot bed, on a 25-foot bed, I'll get 12.5 pounds for, say, a cut of arugula, and I might cut that a few times. So if I can get at least that, half a pound per linear foot, then that's good. That's a yes. That means, okay, this crop has what we consider a high yield. So something like a cabbage or a broccoli is a low yield because the plant takes up about 2.5 foot radius, and you only get one little crown out of it that you harvest. And you might say, well, Curtis, you can grow rapini or other crops like that, and it's true. And then you might categorize those differently. But the things that are these sort of take up all this space to have one small crop, those are crops that I've eliminated from my crop profile. I'm not saying that you need to eliminate them. I'm just saying that if you're going to grow on a small land base, you want to look at it a little differently. So the fourth thing is price. What's the price per pound? If I can get $4 per pound for a product, that is considered high value. So some products I sell are $30 a pound, and some go down to about $2.50 a pound, like say it's the heirloom tomatoes or things like that. So again, it doesn't mean I won't grow it if it doesn't score here. It just means I'm going to look at it differently. So $4 per pound is considered high value for us. The fifth thing, which is very important, is the season. How long is the harvest period of that crop? So there's two different ways you can look at that. If you're talking about tomatoes, how many days of picking do you get for that tomato plant? And if you're talking about a crop like radishes, how many months of the season can you grow that crop in? So for us, radishes, we can grow almost 10 months of the year with the help of some unheated polytunnels. So that would score there. Whereas say a melon, for example, wouldn't score here because a melon goes in the ground in mid-May and you don't really get any crop until about August. So it is a very short period of time. So my base minimum for this is if I can get 4 months of production out of that crop, whether it's a tomato or a lettuce or something else, then that's good. That means it scores here. So if you take your crop list and you go through these 5 categories, you're going to score 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5, some 1 out of 5. My basic rule of thumb is if you're going to be on a small land base, you want to eliminate everything that is less than 3 out of 5, and then just go with 3s, 4s, and 5s. If you're going to go down to a really small land base, like a 1/4 acre, then you want to go just 4s and 5s, perhaps even just 5s. If you want to just farm your front yard, just grease the wheels and get experience with growing, and you've only got 2,000 square feet, like that picture we looked at back here, then just focus on 5s. Just do the high value stuff, and then you'll maximize what you get out of that land. So that's kind of how we're looking at crop value. So let's talk about some specific production techniques. So one way that a farmer on a small land base can make a lot more money, especially during the winter season, and can grow more product without using more land, is get into microgreens. So you can grow microgreens on rafters in your greenhouse like I have here. You can grow microgreens in an indoor lighting rig in your kitchen, or in your garage, or in your grandmother's basement. You can even grow microgreens in the field, and I write about that in my book. The point of talking about microgreens here is that they're very versatile and they offer a farmer a lot of optionality in that you can market them in different ways, you can grow them in different ways, you can grow them in different spaces, and you can effectively grow them year round and you can stack them. So the sky's the limit with how much you can make growing microgreens, as long as your marketplace is willing to buy the product and you're able to move it. You know, you can turn a 400 square foot garage into a $150,000 a year business if you've got a place to sell it. And that's the most important thing, is how you market your product. But at the end of the day, you can scale these all the way if you've got a place to sell them. So here's some sort of tricks that we use on our farm to increase our capacity without taking on more land. So this is an example of what we do, we call double beds, where if we're growing 2 beds or 4 beds or any even unit of beds of a particular crop per week during the season, and that crop is the type of crop that is in and out of the ground quickly, we can forfeit our walkway temporarily to get about 21% more product out of that bed. So the first example on the left here is radishes. I plant radishes at 7 rows in a 30-inch bed. So if I forfeit my 10-inch walkways, and if you have wider walkways, then you'd be able to get more out of it. But if I temporarily forfeit my walkway and I dig it up, go and fork it loose, I've got a video of doing this on YouTube. If you guys go to Urban Farmer Curtis Stone on YouTube, you can see I've got a ton of videos, and I've got a video specifically on doing this with radishes. I can get an extra 3 rows of crop for those 2 beds. So that's an extra 21% of production I can get. Because I'm basically looking at this as in, I need 2 beds of radishes each week to harvest and replant somewhere else. I can move that much product per week. And if I've got a little bit more demand for that product, instead of trying to find more beds to do it, I can just plant all of my units as double beds and get more production. You can do this with white salad turnips, Tokyo turnip or Hakurei they call them. You can also do this with arugula or spinach or things that basically you would just harvest and take out of the ground. So this wouldn't work for a crop like carrots unless you're going to crop it all out at once. It wouldn't work for any crop that you had to do a lot of cut and come again. So I do that with Salanova lettuce. I wouldn't be able to do that with this because I need to get into those walkways to harvest the crop. But if you don't need to do that and you're just cropping it out and you can step on what you've already harvested, then you can just double it up. So this is what we're doing here. We've harvested this arugula, and I'm just walking on the area that was a walkway and turning that bed over immediately and planted it something else. So the fact that I'm stepping on it doesn't make any difference. Another one we can do, this has been a huge success for us on our farm. It's not for everybody, but it's something that if you're relatively fleet of foot and you're nimble, you can get a lot of production out of a very small greenhouse in a relatively short season. So we are interplanting 3 different types of crops here. We've got super short term on the vertical space in the greenhouse. We're growing microgreens. Those are sunflower shoots in particular. Those are planted each week and they're harvested each week. So that space above the greenhouse is making money in the springtime when there's not a lot of other products available. And that shade from that hanging in the rafters isn't affecting us because during the shoulder season, the sun is lower in the sky. So that shadow is being cast outside of the greenhouse somewhere. And then we're stacking a medium-term crop, which is a cut and come again lettuce. So this is Salanova lettuce specifically. We harvest, we cut it, and then in 10 days to 2 weeks it regenerates and we cut it again. And then we're stacking a long-term crop, which is our steady crop, which is the tomatoes interplanted on the side of the walkway in the greenhouse. So when these tomatoes aren't producing anything and they're just growing foliage, we don't need them. We don't need to have the greenhouse dedicated to just them. We can have some other production coming out of the ground to keep that greenhouse making money. Otherwise, if you just plant a greenhouse and you're just sitting with, if you got tomatoes planted in there in the spring, those tomatoes aren't producing anything until late June or early July, generally. Sometimes you might be able to push it a bit, but the idea is that there's a long period of time where you're not in production and those plants are still small, where they're not going to interfere with other crops, and you can use that space on the ground to get something else going. So you can keep revenue coming off the farm. So this is what this looks like throughout the season, because we do this on the flip side on both ends of the season, on the spring and the fall. So in the spring, all of our greenhouses are planted with cut and come again salad greens, and then they're interplanted with the tomatoes, and we're harvesting those salad greens while those tomatoes are growing. Once those tomatoes start to get taller, so about by mid to late June, all the greens come out, and then the tomatoes take over the greenhouse for the season. And there's only about a 3 or 4 week window where those greenhouses aren't producing something like salad greens, and they're flowering and they're setting fruits. And then we start picking our tomatoes, and we're picking the tomatoes all summer. And we are managing our tomatoes with what I call a hard pruning method, where we are stripping off all the body and foliage to create space so the tomatoes aren't competing on the horizontal, and it's also getting light onto the tomatoes, which ripens them quicker, but it also gives us more visual space that I can walk into my greenhouse and I can look down that row of tomatoes and I can say, yeah, I think I'm going to get about 20 pounds from that row. So this creates efficiencies on our farm. So we're managing our tomatoes through hard pruning. And the beauty of doing it this way is that by the end of the season, nearing the end of the season, as the sun starts to recede back into the sky, approaching the fall equinox, now we've created an opportunity for ourselves to open up light onto the bottom story of the greenhouse, and we can interplant salad greens just like we had in the spring amongst the tomatoes without taking them out of the ground, get some fall and winter crops established. So by the time those tomatoes come out of the ground, we've got greenhouses fully established that benefited from the fall warmth to grow, and we go into winter with full greenhouses full of greens that we're harvesting until Christmas and often beyond. So that is a very important part of how we are maximizing our greenhouses there. And so this is just to demonstrate the hard pruning effect. I just put a video out on this on YouTube if you're curious. Basically, the idea is that we're pruning all of the sucker branches, which is the branch that grows between the crotch of a main branch and the stem. We're pruning those, and that's forcing the tomatoes to grow up a twine that we twist up the twine throughout the season. And then as soon as we start to get ripening sets of fruit, we strip every single branch off beneath that. So that's how we essentially manage our tomatoes. So just a few more minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. I'm assuming we're going to go a little past 5 because of our late start. So another thing that is absolutely paramount for us on our farm is we've essentially eliminated weeding. So it doesn't mean that I don't weed, because sometimes I do, but we've narrowed it down to about 4 hours a year we're spending on pulling weeds. And the way we're managing weeds now is by preliminary weed management. So this is using things like tarps, landscape fabrics, flame weeders, and doing a low-till or no-till bed turnover where we're mitigating all of our weed pressure. So let me just go through these in a little more detail. The use of tarps is absolutely critical for eliminating weeds and mitigating the amount of weed pressure you have on your farm. It's a relatively new technique. People like myself and Jean-Martin Fortier out of Quebec have been doing this for a number of years now, and we're starting to see a lot more market gardeners doing this. The basic idea with using tarps is that you go and do bed prep on an area, and if you're not going to plant that area right away, you cover it with a tarp, because you keep the moisture in your soil, you encourage the germination of weeds that are in there because you've created a moist and warm environment that the weeds will germinate in, but then you'll smother them out if you keep the tarp on long enough. But the other way we use tarps today is we are using them to cover kill. So if you have a little bit more land and you're not worried about getting one crop out of the ground and then turning it over right away, like turn and burn, get that crop out, plant it out right away, you can tarp it for a couple weeks. Like in the summer right now, you can tarp it for 2 weeks, pull that tarp off, that crop will be completely disintegrated into the soil, and then you can just do your bed prep, which I'll talk about here shortly. So it reduces your labor because you don't have to go in and manage that crop, pull it out, or stir-a-hoe it, or rototill it, whatever you're doing. We don't rototill anymore, and that's another part of our weed management that I'll show you in a second. But the tarps are absolutely paramount, and in a way, they stack with a tool called a flame weeder here. So in the beginning of our season, we're going out and we're prepping we're prepping entire plots. And so we have what I call it a big push. At the beginning of our season, we have a big push to go out and prep entire urban lots. So we're going in, and you can do this with rototilling if you want. We don't till anymore, but you can go and rototill all your beds, get in your amendments, water them in, and then cover them with a tarp and leave that tarp on until you need them. So it's almost like loading your rifle. Like you're ready for the kill, and you got your rifle loaded so that when it's time to go, you're ready to shoot. It's the same idea here. You do all your preliminary bed prep, all your amendments, form the beds, cover it with a tarp, leave it on until you need them. Then when you're ready to plant, you simply just pull off the tarp and you've got perfectly clean beds where all the weeds have been germinated and killed off or smothered out. If you want to do that in a faster way, you can pair it with the flame weeder. So you might prep your beds, cover them with water them in heavily, cover them with the tarp for a couple weeks. Then when you've got, say, I want to pull the tarp off and do half of these beds, I can pull it off and you'll see all these tiny, like millions and millions of little germinated weeds. Then you can come in with your flame weeder, just burn that top layer. It goes over very quickly, doesn't damage the soil in any way, just boils those little cells. And then you go in and plant into your bed and you get a crop that comes up with no weeds. So the tarps and the flame weeding for us now kind of go hand in hand. The way most people are doing flame weeding before the advent of tarps becoming a sort of a mainstream thing for market gardeners was that you do your bed prep and you just turn the irrigation on your plots and you'd encourage weed growth, and then you'd come in and flame after 5 days or something. The way Elliot Coleman wrote about it in his book, The New Organic Grower, which is an amazing book that every market gardener should read, is he was doing the same thing he was doing a similar thing with carrots, because carrots are a horrible crop to weed because they're so tiny when they come up that if your beds are too weedy, your carrots are gone. So the way Elliot was doing it is he would do his bed prep, plant his carrots, and then, carrots take about 9 days to germinate on average. He would come in on about day 6 and flame the bed before the carrots emerge, and then 2 or 3 days later, those carrots come up without a single weed. So if you have extreme weed pressure, I've done this on both ends, where I used to have a 2-acre lot out in a sort of a peri-urban area of Kelowna here, and it was horribly weedy. So we did this on the both ends of our crops, where we would do our bed prep. We would allow for pre-emergent germination, so all those little weeds would come up. We'd come in and flame. Then we'd plant our crop, and then we'd go in and flame it again 2 days or 3 days before that crop emerged. So you really need to understand your crop cycles in order to do that. A way you can cheat is you can take a little, like a glass bowl or something like that, and put it on the bed, on just a little portion of the bed, and those ones will germinate 2 or 3 days before the ones in the field. So as soon as those ones germinate, then you come in with your flame weeder and flame the bed. There's some other ways you can do it too, but that's basically the idea of how that works. So another part of the elimination of weeding on our farm is using landscape fabric very aggressively. A lot of people would use straw or wood chips, and that's totally fine, but we don't own a lot of the land on our farm, so I don't have time to go in and lay down a bunch of wood chips, and then if I have to be off that plot in 2 years, then that was a lot of wasted labor. I like to use landscape fabric. I use a high-grade fabric that we can reuse for many years, and we can pull it off other plots and put it back somewhere else that we're establishing. But the basic idea here is that I don't want to have any exposed soil on my farm anywhere. I started doing this with beds, so with Salanova lettuce that we do on 6-inch centers as transplants, we would burn little holes. I've got a YouTube video of how to make those holes. If you just go to my YouTube channel, Urban Farmer Curtis Stone, just put in landscape fabric, you'll find the video. And we can burn these little holes. We can make a lot of them at once. It's pretty fast. And again, we'll use these fabrics for many years. So anything that's transplanted on our farm is used with fabrics that have holes, and there's often drip irrigation underneath it. Or if it's overhead, the fabric is breathable anyway, so overhead irrigation works just fine. The idea is that for our lettuce crop, our Salanova lettuce, we grow 4 varieties. It's our #1 crop. We grow more of it than anything else. It makes more money than anything else on our farm. We have essentially eliminated a huge amount of labor involved in that crop. So the transplanting takes a little more time, yes, but there's no weeding ever. And when we harvest that crop, we don't have to sort out weeds on the sorting table. And we make the crop cleaner because when it rains, you don't get the dirt kicking up on the crop, which means you have to wash it more. So we've taken our most popular crop and really made it a lot more efficient and effective by reducing all of that, anything to do with weeds, basically, and I mentioned the dirt. So in the greenhouse, it's a similar thing with tomatoes. once the cut and come again greens are out of the tomatoes and it's just tomatoes, we roll out fabrics and smother out any exposed soil. So all we're looking at is crop. We don't have to pull any weeds in our greenhouse. We don't have to do any management there whatsoever. It's the same with patty pan squash. It's the same with kale. It's the same with anything I'm going to do, which is considered a steady crop that is transplanted into the ground and has a decent amount of space that this can be done with. What we also do is all the perimeters on our plots have landscape fabrics. So we take 6-foot or 3-foot fabrics and roll them around the immediate perimeter of all the plots. So that means there's no tall weeds leaning over into the plot. We've smothered all that out. So that's another step against managing weeds. And then we've even taken it a step further in recent years by making strips. So we make 1-foot wide strips that we can fit into our 10-inch walkways. Sometimes we have to fold them a bit, but we just pin them down. And so we've essentially eliminated pushing a stirrup hoe up and down our beds. And that's something that farmers do a lot of as well. So with all of these things combined, we do very little weeding. And this is the one that is perhaps the most important with managing weeds on your farm, is going to a low-till or no-till, where you're only cultivating the top inch of your soil. And the reason this helps mitigate weed pressure is because every time you rototill your soil, you're bringing up weeds and storing weeds. So there's always weed pressure coming in from everywhere. There's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing we can stop it. It's nature. So the weeds always coming in. You go and rototill your soil. Now you're turning those weed seeds that landed on the surface under the ground to be stored for the next time you till. And then you're also bringing up weed pressure that was there from a previous time. So rototilling essentially just makes your beds more weedy. I mean, there's ways you can rototill by using tarps and flame weeding that would mitigate it. But we've found that by doing the low-till or no-till stuff, that we've have very little weed pressure on our beds. So the basic idea here is that we're not doing any deep cultivation. We're just doing a shallow cultivation. We're amending our soil with compost and organic fertilizers, and then prepping those beds with a tool called a tilther. It comes from Johnny's. There's also a power harrow you can use, and you can even do this by hand. You know, if I was a home scale gardener who wanted to scale up to sell some produce, I would just use a stirrup hoe to scuffle up the bed on the top and then rake it flat and then plant your new crop. So we're not doing any deep cultivation here. We're doing our deep cultivation, which is a shallow, or which is a low impact cultivation with just a broad fork or a pitchfork, loosening up the subsoil at the beginning of the season, get some oxygen down there, and loosening up any hard pans, and then amending and using the tilther and then raking the bed from there. So that's what we're doing. That's how we're prepping our beds at the beginning of the season. And so if I prepped a bunch of beds there at the beginning, I might just cover it with a tarp, like I mentioned before, or I would plant the beds right away. So during the season right now, like we're in high season right now, we're getting into the summer, it's hot, and we're really turning and burning our beds. So here's an example of how we're doing low-till during the mid-season. So this crop that you see here me using the scuffle hoe on is arugula. So what we're doing is we're going in and doing a shallow cultivate. So we're shanking the crop at the base, which keeps the root matter intact in the soil. And then we're removing the top organic residue. That goes in the compost pile, but we're not disturbing anything deep with the bed. Come in, rake that stuff out, put it in the compost pile. Then we come in with organic fertilizer. In this image, I'm using a turkey fertilizer. It's a 524 that we're using. It's a certified organic. Basically, it's a composted turkey manure that's in a pelletized way, a pelletized form. We can't use compost at all of our plots during the season because it takes too much work to move compost. At the beginning of the season, I put about 1 inch or 2 of compost on all my beds. And then as we amend throughout mid-season, we're just using a composite fertilizer that's easier to carry around, because for me to take a truckload of compost to each plot during the high season would be way too much work. And I've tried it, and I've crunched the numbers, and it's not effective for what we need. The crops we're growing in these beds are low feeders. They don't need a lot of heavy nutrients from soil. They're doing just fine with the turkey manure, and the soil is getting better over time. We're continuously adding organic residue to it. So we're adding our turkey fertilizer, our manure, and then we're running the tilther, raking the beds flat, and then direct seeding right after that. So this is what's happening every single week on our farm all season. Once we pass the beginning setup phase of the spring and stopping by about mid-September. So that is basically it, guys. Those are the main techniques we're using on the farm. I think we'll have some time for questions. Just to throw this out to you guys, I have a book for sale. You can buy it anywhere. You can get it on Amazon, and of course, I can't sell it as cheap as Amazon. If you want to buy it from my website, if you're in Canada or the US, I have a discount code if you use Boston UF. It's the code I used when I was in Boston. And you want to buy the premium package, which is a digital compilation of videos and stuff that takes content from the book and goes more in depth. You can get the book and this for free by using this code, and you do that on my website at justtheurbanfarmer.co/book. And I have an online course. I also offer $100 off to anybody who wants to take my online course. You have access to it forever. It has over 30 hours of video footage. We've spent a year building this thing. It has a huge online community. It's almost 200 now. And anybody who uses Boston UF can get a $100 discount off on there. And one more thing, I've got a YouTube channel I mentioned a couple times, tons of free content up there. I'm putting a video up a day. And I've got a podcast that I do called The Urban Farmer at Permaculture Voices. You can check that out. We're on season 2. We've got, I think, around 50 episodes now. And anybody who wants to contact me and is interested in any of my farm websites up there, Facebook page, and all that. So I guess we'll just go into questions now.
Thank you, Curtis. That was awesome. Just a reminder to everybody, you can type your questions into the chat feature. It's a little blue icon just above Curtis's video. Curtis, can I ask a question just to get us started?
Absolutely.
I just noticed you have so many sites that you're managing. Do you ever have issues with trespassing or dogs getting in? Or I'm just imagining having so many pieces of land all over the place.
Yeah. Sometimes, like, I've never really had issues with theft. It's never been a problem. I find across the socioeconomic level, I think it's a cultural thing too, probably where I am, but people really respect a garden, and I've never had anybody come in. And at the end of the day, if somebody were to come in and steal a few radishes, I probably wouldn't even notice. Would get on their hands and knees and harvest some salad greens. It's never been an issue for us. Maybe there's certain crops that are more prone to easy theft than others, like, you know, big ripened tomatoes are easy for somebody to grab. But cut and come in greens or root crops, not so much. So the theft has never been an issue. Having said that, we always do have fairly good fencing on our farm plots. Except my front yard, there's no fence, but I know everybody in my community here very well, and they respect and appreciate what we do, so it's never been an issue. Dogs and things like that, yes, but again, it's just fencing, setting up good fencing. It's usually something that goes into a contract. On a lease agreement, when I take on a new plot, that there needs to be some kind of fencing. I won't farm plots if it's in a high trafficked area or close to a park if there's no fencing. So if somebody wants me to farm there, then they pay for the fencing. And yeah, so that's more or less it. Okay, so I can't see the questions for some reason. Maybe I need to minimize my screen here.
I can also read them to you.
Yeah, can you read them to me, Brittany? Because for some reason, I can't find them.
How many people work for you? Do you employ year-round? Do you have, like, part-time labor when you need, you know, extra help prepping the beds?
Yep. For the most part, our farm is run by 2 people. My main farm manager he's a contractor, so he runs his own business. He also works with other people, but so I don't technically have employees. I have contractors, and that comes from Joel Salatin wrote a great piece about that called Stacking Fiefdoms, where you bring in a higher level of accountability and people who are more driven when you're using people as independent LLCs for you guys in the U.S. So that's how I prefer to do it. I don't like to have employees because there's too much red tape with government stuff, and it's easier if people just write me an invoice. So everybody who works for me is an independent contractor who also works for other entities.
Question about just sort of the landscape fabric and the other things that you use. For somebody who's just starting out, rationalizing the investment, can you talk through just really quick, you know, landscape fabric is, for the labor saving, probably pretty cheap, but do you just kind of like buy a little bit more as you need it? How did you get started in investing?
Yeah, so I just buy it. I buy 300-foot rolls. Sometimes I buy 600-foot rolls. It's something I don't need to buy a lot of. It's kind of like I bought a bit more this season than last season just because I took on a bit more land and started to use it everywhere. But it's not really a big investment. You're looking at maybe $1,000 to get a third of an acre farm like ours is set up with your perimeters, even walkways, and then having fabrics on all of your beds that have transplant crops. You're not really looking at more than $1,000, and you will easily save that in weeding in your first year.
Yeah. And then another question, what size hoop houses are you using on your plot?
I have two different types of hoop houses. I have one in my backyard that's an 18 by 50, and then I have two at another lot that are 12 by 40. They're sort of the Johnny's Caterpillar tunnel style, built them myself.
Another question, how have you identified the 20% of customers who bring in the 80% of sales? I'm reading this question. I imagine that it's easier to identify that with your restaurant customers since it's easier to track their sales, but how do you do that in the farmer's market setting?
No, it's actually easier to do in the farmer's market, because if you're at the farmer's market, you just remember the faces of the people that come to your market. And the really easy way to do it is keep a notepad or use your phone or something. And if you recognize somebody who comes back week in and week out, ask them their name and get to know them, and then write their name down. So don't give me the excuse that you can't remember names. Write it down, and then next time they come to your stand, call them by their name, and they'll keep coming, and they'll bring their friend next time. And so you can, in a way, manifest that 20% of people that bring your 80%. It's just recognition. You just recognize those people. And yes, of course, with the restaurants and the people spending the money, that's easy to do. It's just flipping some numbers around on a spreadsheet to figure out who's spending money. But that's essentially it, is just recognizing who those people are.
Great. Curtis, we're running out of time. One more question. How do you account for travel time, or is there any techniques that you have for minimizing the amount of time that's spent traveling between sites?
Between the sites, yes, exactly. That's a good question, and that's the whole idea behind the high rotation and bi-rotation system, is that the plots that are less intensive, they're further away, so I only go to them once a week. Sometimes I don't even go to them during a week. And the plots that are being constantly worked, those are the plots that are closest to me. So all the 4 plots that are our high rotation plots, they are all within 3 blocks. So I can buzz over to any of those on my bike in minutes. So the travel time there isn't an issue at all. When I started, it was, because I had plots all over town, and I was traveling 20 minutes to go and do an hour of work at one plot, and so that isn't effective. So that's a big part of how we've designed our farm, is according to these zones of intensity.
Great. And one last question before we wrap this up, a question on, do you have your irrigation on timers?
Absolutely. Everything's on timers. There's no management that I have to do. We set it up, and then I don't have to think about it.
I guess just a follow-up for me, do you have issues with like hoses busting or leaks or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I put out a video last week of me going to fix a busted irrigation line that I discovered. And I mean, we're at our high rotation plots, we're at almost every day of the week at some point. And the bi-rotation plots, not so much. So yeah, I mean, you got to make sure that things are set up properly. We use pressure reducers, we use filters. There's a lot, my online course, we really get into setting up irrigation. It's something that I spent a lot of time on and money wasted on when I started. And if somebody would have taught me some of the basic things to do, I would have saved a ton of time and money on it. But yeah, it's all set up, and yeah, we have those problems here and there, and we fix them and move forward.
Awesome. Curtis, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know this is the middle of your day, the middle of your afternoon anyways over there in BC. Just so everybody knows, this webinar is recorded, so if you came in the middle, you can watch the recording. It should be up in about 2 weeks on the NOFAMAS YouTube channel. And again, like Curtis said, he's got a lot of information on his YouTube channel. Can you just remind everybody how to get there, Curtis?
Yep, just go to YouTube and put in Urban Farmer Curtis Stone. Awesome. And subscribe. I'm vlogging daily, so I'm putting up a video every day, Monday to Friday, and sometimes Saturday. And I'm also continuing to stream out content videos. I have a series of videos called Crop Focus, In Focus, where I look at tools, and then I have in practice videos, which are looking at specific techniques on how to manage certain things. So there's a ton of content up there.
Awesome. Curtis, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we see you out on the East Coast again sometime.
All right, you're welcome. Have a great day.
All right, take care, everybody.
Take care.